If you look on that scale of probability, I would absolutely say that it's a high probability that the money going into Ukraine is being recycled back to the politicians. It just makes sense. Between business cutouts, political organizations, humanitarian aid and tax benefits, future benefits, right? It makes total sense that there's a high probability that a portion of the money that's going into Ukraine is going to come right back into politicians' pockets. Mm-hmm. But is it going to be like a simple direct link? No. It's going to be some convoluted, either legal or commonly accepted, unprosecutable type of process to bring that money back in.
What would that look like?
I mean, it could look like a number of things. So keep in mind, the biggest thing to keep in mind is that we're all talking about war in Ukraine. Nobody is talking about what happens after the war is over. Ukraine is destroyed. Entire cities have been leveled. The place was poverty-stricken before the cities were leveled. So the day after this war is over, the whole country needs to rebuild. Who's going to get the contracts to rebuild the country?
We are.
And when that happens, where's the money going to come from for those contracts?
Us.
And from the Ukrainian government that's going to be in charge of the reconstruction, right? That's going to bring money back into American businesses. That's going to bring tax incentives to American businesses. That's going to bring all sorts of secondary and tertiary financial benefits, right? Not to mention the fact that if Ukraine wins, which on the likelihood scale is low, but if Ukraine wins, there's going to be some kind of international court, some sort of NATO endeavor to essentially fine Russia or create debt for Russia to help fund and pay back the damage that was done to Ukraine. So that means Russian money is going to be used to pay back the United States. Also, don't forget, the United States has frozen Russian funds in American banks. They've been frozen for 6 months, just sitting there. What's that money going to be used for? The reconstruction of Ukraine. Who's it going to go to? American companies, right? So for sure, that's how that money is going to work, because that's not legally prosecutable, right? Nobody's breaking a law, especially not an American law, by letting that happen. But it's all still in the best interest of the United States. Remember earlier we were talking about how the one kind of solid, consistent point from president to president has been making decisions that make America remain as close to the economic superpower as they can be. The war in Europe, the current war in Europe, and the aftermath of the war in Europe, in many, many ways, all benefits the United States. So the Biden administration, it's in their best interest to keep this conflict going. So the last kind of element, again, that people aren't really talking about, right? There's the reconstruction of Europe. There's a reconstruction of Ukraine. People aren't talking about that. The other thing people aren't talking about is NATO's role in the reconstruction of Ukraine and NATO's role in the Ukraine conflict. Ukraine and Russia, like you and I discussed, that is actually a conflict in Europe. We shouldn't talk about it just as Ukraine-Russia. We should talk about it as the European conflict. When you look at it as a European conflict, it's really interesting because NATO, and specifically the European countries in NATO, take America out, take Canada out, the European countries in NATO are very much divided on what to do in Ukraine. Germany didn't want to send them weapons. They only caved under intense pressure from the United States, right? The French president has been outspoken from the very beginning that he didn't want to stir up or anger and incite additional Russian aggression. He was the one that made Biden stop talking such fervent. I mean, if you recall, Biden made a speech in Poland where he called for the unseating of Putin, right? He called for regime change in Poland until President Macron came in and said, we don't talk about that, right? You're not welcome to speak that way in NATO territory, right? So the French president, the German chancellor, even Hungary as a country as a whole has taken a very strong stance against American direction of NATO. So if we were to take America out of NATO right now, support for Ukraine would dry up. The NATO countries, the European countries themselves, they don't want this conflict. They've really only acquiesced to intense American pressure for this conflict. And because America has put so much money into the conflict itself, when the conflict is over, America's not going to want to put in the money for humanitarian aid. America's going to want to get its payback. It's going to want to be paid back for reconstruction efforts, but it's going to force the NATO partners to take care of all the humanitarian aid, right? So it's this situation where Europe can see the writing on the wall. Europe's in a hurt locker. They have to do what America tells them to do right now, because America is like the only superpower on their side. China wants to woo Europe, but Europe doesn't trust China. And Russia's right on the doorstep of Europe, so they don't want to trust Russia. So they're left with only one ally, and it's us, and we're bullies too. So Europe doesn't really know what to do. They don't want this conflict. They've paid the price. Absolutely, there was an energy crisis all winter. It was not as drastic as some of us were expecting it to be because winter was warm, but they were still paying 400 times the price, or 400% more for energy than what they were paying before. Businesses still shut down. Governments had to subsidize individual people to be able to pay their their heating bills and their gas bills over the winter, right? And it's not over yet. It's only March. So there's still cold weather in Europe. So it's just Europe and the United States are not nearly as aligned as American headlines want you to believe. And all you have to do to see that is read European headlines, right? Read a newspaper from the UK. Read a periodical that comes out of Europe. Just put away CNN, definitely put away CNN. Put away all of your liberal news sources that are based in the United States. And you can still read liberal news sources in Europe, and you'll get a more accurate representation of the fact that Europe is not nearly as aligned as our newspapers try to make us think they are. And they're worried. They're worried that they're going to get called in to spend a bunch of their money to help rebuild a Ukraine that never benefited them.
Interesting.